Welcome to the WanderLearn Show. I'm your host, Francie Tapon. This is my second interview with Glen Van Peski in a series that talks about his new book, which is called Take Less, Do More. It's all about some of the backpacking lessons he's had in the last decades of his life, where he's made these ultralight gear. And, well, it's surprising, but a lot of things that you do in backpacking has lessons in everyday life. And that's kind of what we dive into in this episode. And it can be something simple, like learning to subtract things away from your life and not always to try to add and add and add and add and add. Sometimes the best thing to do is to remove. And that's one of the concepts. Also to lighten your load, to approach minimalism and to live a simple life. This is all some of the great lessons that are captivated in his book just so well. I highly recommend it. Enjoy my conversation with Glen Van Peski. On a more practical level, one thing I learned about your book is about the Arizona Buckskin Gulch. Never heard of it. Tell us a little bit about it.
Buckskin Gulch is kind of cool. And actually, I owe a friend of mine wanted to do a hike. He was president of Pro Bar, but he didn't have time to plan it. So he says, I want to do this Buckskin Gulch. And so that was the first time I'd been down it when I planned the trip for him. And now it's an annual trip I take in the spring. And it's the longest slot canyon in the United States. Some say the world. I don't know about that. But it's super amazingly beautiful, especially depending on what kind of light, if you get some sun on it. And it's enough of a challenge. I'm reading The Comfort Crisis right now, and they talk about the need for us to be challenged and to be uncomfortable as a way of resetting. It's something that as humans we need, that's important to us. It's different every year. It's interesting because the bottom is eroding continually. Like in the, dozen or so years I've been doing this, there's a spot at the beginning where it's narrow and there's a big boulder jam there. And so the water flows over that and then starts to erode. And that was like a hop down the first year I did it. And then it got to be a ladder, and now it's so deep that you actually have to go around. But it's just interesting. It looks like nothing's changing, but when you do it year after year after year, you see, oh yeah, that's lower than it was last year. But it's
how long does it take?
It depends on how you do it. I do kind of a loop from Wire Pass to White House trailhead, and I do it over kind of 3 days, 2.5, 3 days. Lots of people hike all the way out to Glenn's Ferry. I like to do kind of a sampler. You get the feel for it and being able to fit it in. Most people have a schedule they're trying to fit it into.
Right, and it's apparently you got to get permits like way in advance.
Yeah, it's a 4-month rolling permit. So April opens on January 1st. So New Year's Eve. You know where I'm at. I'm at my computer trying to nab permits for Buckskin Gulch. Yeah.
Everybody else is blowing their trumpets, and you're like on the PC.
Yep.
Very cool. Now you backpack with. Go ahead.
And it's a great thing that I can do because it's for most people it's kind of a different thing, and I know it was for me. I had a lot of questions I didn't know, but after this many years of doing it. I can be a resource and just invite people. It's all planned. I can answer questions. They have to obviously go through the challenges themselves, but I'm a resource. I make it easy for them to do it. And so I open this trip up every year to the list, what I call the list, which is a bunch of people that are, have something to say but nothing to prove. They're good company in the backcountry. They're reasonably fit and they've got their gear organized. And so the first 7 or 8 that reply get to go on the trip.
Awesome. And speaking about one of the people on the list was Matthew McConaughey, the actor. And he taught you not how to act, but how to stop somebody from snoring. What's the technique there?
The technique there is apparently, now I have not tried this
Francine, your wife doesn't snore apparently.
I was good. Or if she did, I'm not about to flick her throat in the middle of the night. That would be dangerous. Yeah, no, apparently you flick the Adam's apple of the offending snorer, and that puts him right back to sleep.
With your finger.
With your finger, yep.
Just flick it, not that hard, but enough to I'm just wondering, if you just poke somebody, it's sometimes I find that if you just poke somebody, that's enough to get them to stop. So I wonder if it's like a semi-placebo effect here.
It could be just to kind of interrupt the process. Yeah.
All right.
But everything's cooler when Matthew McConaughey does it. So.
Mm-hmm. Now tell us about your son, Derek. What life lessons has he taught you?
Well, he was born severely disabled, and then he died before his 20th birthday. So he's been gone a number of years, died on Mother's Day. He taught me about things that you can't control. As an engineer, I'm always trying to plan for things and figure things out. It's like I bought a card the other day that said, everything is figure-outable, which makes a great card, but actually there's some things in life that aren't actually figure-outable. Or maybe fixable would be a better word. There's things that I can't fix.
And sometimes you just have to learn to accept them.
Exactly. You need to be okay with things not being okay.
Like you couldn't fix Derek maybe the way you would have liked to.
Right.
Fix him.
There's nothing. Right. There's no amount of extra training or physical therapy or speech therapy. There was nothing he was born without a brain. There was nothing that was going to make up that difference.
The other thing that he did is he ignited spirituality within you, religiosity in you that had been, I guess, dormant, I suppose. That was another thing that had a profound impact.
Yeah. I grew up without any really church experience. My mom, after the divorce, joined the local Quaker meeting back east, or Society of Friends. Right.
I always wonder, if you had, let's say, been born in India or in Pakistan, would you have gravitated to another religion potentially? If, assuming you had Derek and the whole situation, but you were in a different environment.
Yeah, it's entirely possible. It's you never know.
I have a degree in religion, so I'm always fascinated by these kind of questions, and so I go down that deep end. But this podcast is not so much about that. It's more about chopsticks and how you can use them as tent stakes. When I read that, I was like, only Glen will think of this. Everybody looks at a chopstick and just sees a chopstick, but Glen sees it as a potential tent stake. In fact, you used it as a tent stake.
Yeah, I used it as a tent stake actually in 1976 when I rode my bicycle across the country, and then recently went back to it because I was thinking about it, and actually was in Japan being interviewed, and they asked me, how come you're pretty good with the chopsticks? And I explained the bike trip, and I'm eating everything with a couple of chopsticks because that's all I had. And after that, I got thinking, why don't I do that anymore? So we actually came up with Chopstakes, which are tent stakes that are formed as chopsticks. So that's what I use now. We're still looking for a manufacturer to bring them to market, but we've got some prototypes that are in my pack.
Well, I hope the manufacturer is in China, because they should be able to get that one down.
Yeah, it's harder than you'd think to, do we make them out of titanium or aluminum? And it's, we've got
what's the difference? Why is what's the trade-off between titanium and aluminum?
Less people work in titanium, and the weight, because aluminum you could maybe go hollow, but the shape we want the notches and the loops, so you could put a little string in it because it works better as a stake that way. So just a lot of considerations.
Okay. Always trade-offs. Only an engineer would ever imagine.
Yeah. Now plus, it's one of those. It's one of those things with any product I come up. The next, once I get it to where I like it, the next question with the Gossman Gear design team is like, okay, are there more than 5 other people in the world besides Glen who thinks this is a good idea? And so. We're not convinced there's a huge market for chopsticks, so it's kind of on the back burner. It's not something we're devoting a lot of brain power to.
Right. Good call. devote some brain power to recounting one of your favorite stories. It's a tale about 4 very hungry boys on bicycles, and how they were served food on a Sunday morning, or at least on a summer morning, should I say. Tell us about that story in 1976.
Yeah, this impressed on me, made an impression on kind of generosity and being kind and impacting other people's lives. So when my 3 friends and I were riding our bicycles after I graduated high school in 1976, riding them across the country, if we were in a small town, we would typically, towards the end of the day, go, pick a nice looking front lawn and go up and knock on the door and say, hey, we're riding our bicycles across the country. Can we camp on your front lawn tonight? And I never remember being turned down. And people were always, interested in what we were doing. So this one evening, went up and knocked on the door, and an old guy answered, and he came out and asked, what time we left in the morning usually. And I said, well, we're only in Illinois. We got a long way to go. We usually get started about 7 o'clock in the morning. And he looked disappointed. And I said, well, why do you ask? And he said, well, my wife and I would really like to make you guys a proper breakfast to send you on your way. But he said, my wife has really bad arthritis, and it's particularly brutal in the morning, so she just can't get up that early. And I said, well, we appreciate the thought, but we don't need anything. We're just happy to have a nice place to spend the night to camp.
And of course, you want to get an early start, right?
Yeah, we got miles to do, So,
because if you had dinner at 8, breakfast at 8, then you won't get out the door by 10 maybe, or whatever.
Right. And I don't think, probably she wasn't getting up till 9. So, who knows what time we would have gotten out there. So the next morning, it's early. We're packing up our gear, getting everything on the bikes. And the door to the house opens, and he beckons us over. His wife had gotten up early. I don't know how many aspirin she had to take or what kind of pain she had to deal with, but there was a breakfast the likes of which we had never seen. There were eggs and bacon and sausage and biscuits and potatoes and fruit and muffins and gravy. And there was so much food. And I'm pretty sure we ate through their week's worth of breakfast groceries, probably in one sitting. 4 hungry boys. We were probably pushing 10,000 calories a day at that point. And that always stuck with me. I've been telling that story for almost 50 years now. And I like to think that as long as they lived, they told that story from their perspective. Hey, remember that summer in 76 when those 4 boys showed up and ate us out of a week's worth of groceries?
For somebody who's listening to this and wondering, okay, well, what is the big takeaway? For you, what is the big takeaway?
That sometimes life gives you opportunities to be generous, and you never know the impact that's going to have on someone else's life. She had a morning of pain, but it made an impression on me about being generous and impacting other people's lives that has continued to this day. And every time I tell the story, it impacts other people.
On page 80 of your book, you say a great thing. It says, if I were always to insist on being the giver in every situation, then I'm trying to be in control and to feed my ego. Plus, the circulation of giving and receiving stops if I refuse to also receive. And then later you say, the couple taught us all that pre-dawn morning that they had something special to add to the world, and they were going to add their gift despite my intransigence, and thank goodness. And so to me, I have a friend of mine, Glenn. She's incredibly generous person. Almost to a fault. She just gives all the time. And it's very hard for me to give back. And I think, like you say here, you say when you refuse the goodness of other people who offer you, you do that, you rob a fellow human being of their God-given need to be of service to others, to feel that their contribution matters. That's what you say in your book.
Yeah, exactly. You have to do both. I mean, it's actually, if you refuse to receive generosity, it's actually being selfish, kind of the opposite of being generous.
Yeah. Yeah, and it's a paradox for some who are used to giving, and then they say, but I'm such a great guy. And you are, but they don't realize it from the other person's perspective, which is, hey, I want to give back. I want to do something for you. There's another great line. It seems that perfection is attained not when there's nothing more to add, but when there is nothing more to remove. That is from Antoine de Saint-Exupéry, and the Little Prince, I think. And you tackle that concept of subtraction, of sometimes removing. Talk a little bit about that, Glenn.
Yeah, there's a fascinating book by Leidy Klotz called Subtract. And he lays out how, as humans, and I've noticed this in my own life, when we have a problem to solve, we immediately go to what can we add to fix the problem. And he did a bunch of super interesting studies on, presenting problems to people when you could solve it by subtracting, like squares or music or whatever the case may be. But people, to a large degree, would try and solve it by adding. And so that's always our impulse, the way we're wired, is to try and add things to solve problems. But we should train ourselves actually to see if we can subtract to solve the problem. And so, I got to do that as in civil engineering, instead of bringing more fill in, you need to just redesign so you can solve the problem with less fill, or whatever the case may be. And with backpacking, it's the same thing. I'm always looking for, how can I solve a problem with less weight? Because of course you have to carry all that weight. And in the rest of life, solving other problems, if you're adding stuff, that's usually, expense or mass or energy or impact to the environment or whatever the case may be. Adding stuff costs something.
And speaking about solving problems, talk about your debit card that you put 5% of your income on. Explain that.
Well, it started at 5%. It's a lot more than that now. But to be intentional about generosity, we created a separate account. We call it our tithing account. You call it gratitude account, or in the early days, I called it a world peace account for some reason. And we wanted to make sure that we were being generous in an intentional way. And so we created a separate checking account that every time we have income, a set percentage goes into that account. And that way, when needs come across our path, we don't have to say, oh, can we afford to help out? Can we afford to be generous? Because the money's already set aside. So we just need to make the decision, does this have our name on it? Is this something that we're supposed to address? And then if we decide it is, then we have the money already set aside to do that in a separate account. And it's interesting to me, recently read Infectious Generosity.
Chris Anderson,
that's it. Have heard some of these studies that most people think if they had 20% more income, then they'd be happy. To be happy, 20% more money would do it. But of course, studies show that when people actually get that 20% more money, the happiness fades pretty quickly, because then you think, well, if I just had 20% more money, then I'd be happy for sure, because then I could get that other car or better boat or whatever the case may be. And they did studies on generosity where they gave people money that you could either keep or give away. And then they'd interview the people afterwards, and they determined that the happiness from generosity, from being generous, is roughly equivalent to a doubling of salary. So Giving them doubling your salary makes you about as happy as being generous. But the kicker is the happiness from generosity, from giving to others, doesn't fade. If you double your salary, you're happy, sure, for 3 months, 4 months, 6 months. But that happiness from generosity continues. It doesn't diminish with the passage of time. And it was interesting to me how most of the studies were kind of found money for people. They gave them money to be generous with or to keep. And so I think for us, creating this gratitude account kind of duplicates that situation. It's money that we can give, but it's not in our budget anymore because we already took it out of our budget. And so our rule is, when I don't notice the giving, and this could be different for everyone, but I want it to be sacrificial. I want to live differently. And so if I get to the point where I don't notice it, then we increase the percentage.
That's amazing. And it's a very good way to just make it automatic. And how do you decide, like Bill Gates, he's got billions to give away and he's got a process to give away, like how to give it away. How do you decide? Do you have a certain metric, a certain way? Is it gut feeling?
There's some traditional charities that we support. We support our local church. We support children's funds. We have some children that we've adopted in other countries. And then a lot of them are non-traditional. We have a friend who's dying of cancer, friend of Francie's that she went to school with. And I don't know, she's probably in her final month at this point. But she was in a lot of pain because the cancer's just eating her alive, and her insurance didn't cover some infusion that really made her life better. Well, we can write a check for that. That's Francie worked with a gal a few years back whose son had made some bad decisions, ended up in prison and died in prison, and she didn't have money for a funeral. It's like, yeah, we can write a check. It's not, so it's basically it's things that come across our path that, does this have our name on it? We were,
so it's more instinct. It's more like a gut feel as opposed to some sort of spreadsheet.
Yeah, definitely a gut feel, things that God has put across our path. It's not usually people writing, saying, hey, I need some money. Can you help?
Right. Got it. We're going to take a short pause here. And when we come back, we're going to talk about a guy who lost his job to an Indian and what he learned from that process by going to India. So we'll do that next. And that ends this episode of the WanderLearn podcast, where we explore travel, technology, and transformation. If you'd like to see the show notes with links to what we've talked about, go to wanderlearn.com and click on this episode. If you'd like to connect with me, just remember Tapon. That's my first initial and my last name. Tapon is always my social media username. My website is ftapon.com. Do you want to leave me an anonymous voicemail where you can make a comment or ask a question? Then go to speakpipe.com/ftapon. Furthermore, if you'd like to get rewarded for supporting my projects, then go to patreon.com/ftapon. That's where you can pick up some remarkable rewards for as little as $2 a month. Now, 5 quick favors. Number 1, subscribe to the WanderLearn podcast. 2, download it. 3, share it. 4, review it. And 5, sign up for my newsletter at wanderlearn.com. Our theme music was composed by Eric Stratman. This is Francis Tapon, encouraging you to wander and learn.